Greetings, hello. You've heard all of this before, but I guess it bears repeating. Welcome to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Thompson Trust, the Vermont Arts Council, the Vermont Humanities Council, and the Wyndham Foundation. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and we heartily encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers. Every year we start from scratch fundraising for the following year. Your donations allow us to present the festival, and we encourage you to contribute using the QR code on this donor card over there on the table, or you can use the QR code on the back of the program, or just deposit something in the donation box. We really cannot do it without you, and we so appreciate your support. Please take a moment to turn off the ringer in your phone, but please do use phones to take pictures and share them on social media. All right, thank you. What?
No, it's a museum kind of show.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, that's right. Oh, yes. No flash, no flash. Yeah, right, okay. Oh, this is going to be fun. Okay. I can tell. Jill Bialosky is a poet, novelist, essayist, and executive editor and vice president at W.W. Norton Company. She is the author of 4 volumes of poetry, 3 novels, and 2 recent memoirs. She co-edited with Helen Schulman an anthology, Wanting a Child. Her poems and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Kenyon Review, Harvard Review, and Best American Poetry, to say nothing of Cleveland Noir, which was featured last night. So it's a lot of fun cross-pollination here. Karen Benson, in an interview in Book Slut, called her a versatile and accomplished woman of letters. In whichever genre she is writing, her work stands out for its compassionate attention to the psyche of the imperfect humans struggling through their lives. Her new novel, The Deception, centers on a poet and teacher who finds hope and instruction in the classical wings of the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Please welcome Jill Bialosky.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be back in Brattleboro. So many years ago, I was a student at Wyndham College in Putney, Vermont. Does anyone remember? Yes. So sadly, the college went bankrupt, and I was in a tough spot, but I was so glad to have been at Wyndham and in Vermont, and it's great to be back in Brattleboro. I'm excited about our panel. We found a lot of things in common with our books that we're planned to talk about. So I won the coin toss, so I'm going first. And I'm going to just begin by telling you briefly about how this novel came to be, and then I'll read from it. So The Deceptions was inspired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and my many visits there. A few years ago, I went to the museum and 3 things coalesced. I was listening on audio to Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, and if you haven't heard it, you must, because the actress Claire Danes is narrating, and it's absolutely fabulous. And her voice in that poem just brought it all to life for me in such a different way than when I was a young high school student trying to get through the Odyssey. So I highly recommend that. Her translation opens with the lines about Odysseus, "Let me tell you about a complicated man." And what a great first line. And by the way, there is a complicated man in The Deceptions. So I happened to be listening to the audio of the Odyssey as I walked through the park on a fall day into the museum. And because the poem, of course, you know, is about the Greek and Romans and the gods, I decided on this particular day to roam through the Greek and Roman rooms. And during this time, it was sort of the beginning of the Me Too movement. And the movement had been unleashed, and I was angry at the entitlement of the patriarch, and I began to try to trace in my mind how the patriarch had shaped me as a young woman coming of age, how often, without knowing it, I had bowed to the patriarch, how often I had listened to, and excuse the men here, I'm not meaning to shame anyone here, but how often I had listened to the mansplaining throughout my coming of age in grad school and my career as an editor. And of course, many of you know that drill, so I don't need to go into it in depth. But I wanted to figure out how I could write about this, as Emily Dickinson calls slant. How can you write about the patriarch slant, and in a fun way? And so I suddenly, walking through the Greek and Roman rooms, it exploded as if the idea burst through my head like Athena, who was born from Zeus's forehead. I decided in that moment, and I was taking photos of many of the gods and goddesses and the statues and the artifacts that I was entranced by. And so I decided that I would invent a protagonist, a woman. She would be a poet, and she would be teaching English at an all-boys prep school, because wouldn't that be an institution founded on ideas of the patriarch? And she would have to be in trouble, because all fiction must begin with some kind of trouble. So I decided that she would be in a crisis when the book opened. She's middle-aged, she's married, and her only son has left for college. And for the first time in a long time, she and her husband are alone together, and suddenly they find themselves strangers. When the book opens, a violation has happened to my character, and she has repressed it. And on top of all this, she's expecting the publication of her third book of poetry, a book-length poem called The Rape of the Swan. And she's just been told by her editor at a very small press that the book is going to be reviewed by the New York Times. She's kind of a wreck over this. She feels that her standing as a poet depends, she naively feels that her standing as a poet depends on this review. So she's in a crisis. The novel in the first paragraph opens with these lines, "Something terrible has happened and I don't know what to do." And her only source of comfort is the museum, where she hopes the gods and goddesses will get her through. Throughout the novel, as she's navigating this slippery terrain, the statues suddenly take on their own life in her head, and they and their mythologies intersect with hers. So I'm going to read you a small section, 8 minutes, when my at first unnamed protagonist comes to the museum in distress after a confrontation with her husband, and she meets some of the gods. She also has a neighbor in the building where she lives who is like her doppelganger or her other self, who's also in trouble in her marriage. Sorry, if you don't mind, I just want to put those papers away. Museum. In line, I wait to get a new membership card. The young man who takes my information has a lovely smile, thick tortoiseshell frame glasses, and short dark brown hair with locks that fall in the middle of his brow. His face bears a resemblance to a portrait I've seen in the museum, but I can't quite remember it. My guess is that he is committed to art because people who work at the museum, my friend here, the man who signs up new members, the museum guards who stand like stoic pillars before each gallery must be afflicted with the need to behold. One must be a certain type of being to subscribe to passing one's days in the solitude and service of art. May I help you find something, he asks after he's finished with my details. Do you have a favorite gallery, I ask, and color? He probably hates that question. What did you come to see? What do you like? He jumps and fidgets when he speaks. I don't know. I should know. You're right. The gods. I'll go to the Greek and Roman rooms, I say, or perhaps the Temple of Dundur, he says, brightening. How does he know that I worship in the temple? It's the place I used to take my son, I say, but today I don't know. I want tragedy. I can't wash away the disdain on my husband's face. I must live with it as my punishment. The gods will understand. Then you're right, off you go, the Greek and Roman rooms, he says. Why not start with the Greeks? There's this incredible marble statue of Heracles. I'll look for it, I say. Thank you. I wind the scarf around my neck to hide my creases. Anything else I can help you with, he says, and I jolt, aware our transaction has ended and people are waiting behind me. Is he flirting with me, I wonder, before remembering I'm too old to be flirted with. And he's barely older than my son, yet his deep, wide brown eyes, like the light reflected in a dark pond, carry me far. I enter the gallery and go right to it. Oh my God, Heracles, he's right, that muscular chest. And I didn't mention that my book also has photos, so this is Heracles. The curve in his waist. Years ago, before I was married, I went to the Prado on a trip with my roommate. We stayed in a hostel and explored the museums. Zurbaran's Heracles cycle, that one painting where he swoops down, arms outstretched, each hand on a grip bolted to the boulders separating the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, one of his 12 labors after he murdered his wife and children. What labors must I endure for what I've done? Why do I blame myself? But I do. He looks so vulnerable, I want to hug him, speak to him. Those feet barely visible on the rock floor suggest the ghost we can't see. I mourn the rest of him. Even his cock is cut off, his torso so beautifully incomplete, the shoulders slightly caved by an internal longing for what he can't have. Is this what the boy man at the membership table sees? I take a photo on my iPad. I have a cornucopia of photos of the gods and goddesses, and as of late, they've taken on new meaning. I sometimes scroll through them admiring their power, their cold beauty. A guard taps me on the shoulder, tells me to step back. I'm too close. Yes, I'm too close. This statue so vulnerably realized, or is it that it represents what I've deprived my husband of? My husband has a voracious appetite for sex. It is sadly a Congress for which I am no longer a member. I have lost all desire. The libido isn't the life force, it's a fragile, fickle drive. What is it about the curved chest that moves me so? Without desire, it is impossible to make love. My husband does not understand that my yearning is without limits, nor that I am not a vessel. Though I long to connect. I don't yet know how or if I can anymore. These headless women beckon from the hard bench where I sit. Look at them, what blissful friendship. One leg kicked up flirtatiously while the other bears the weight. And this is the marble statue, of the Three Graces. I wonder if these lovely beings were to service the gods. The gods are entitled to any mortal they claim, even if they have to turn themselves into bulls or swans to mate. The Three Graces are handmaidens of Aphrodite. Cronus castrated Uranus and threw his genitals into the sea, and lo and behold, lovely Aphrodite emerged from the sea foam. In every story, she is beautiful and sought after. Her beauty concerned the gods who feared that those in desire of her would come to war. Clever Zeus married her off to Hephaestus, the god of fire, who was born lame and grotesque to protect her from rivals. What did Zeus think, that he could stop her? Beautiful Aphrodite, she did what she pleased. Surely she did not worry about pleasing her husband or hate herself for her acts of infidelity. Those gods and goddesses, they have no shame. A gang of teenagers rushes in. Their kids can't keep quiet, can't keep their hands off one another, can't stop talking, pushing, and shoving in their attempt to be heard and noticed. A woman, their teacher, comes into the gallery to attempt to harness them. My phone vibrates. A text is coming through. Maybe my son. I take my phone from my pocket. It's my neighbor. I can't take it, she texts. He's been in the theater all afternoon watching soccer. It's like living with a corpse, she texts me. Ta. Even though my neighbor is sometimes a nuisance, she makes me feel less lonely, and she makes me laugh. I need her to judge against my own motivations, jealousies, peculiarities. Otherwise, I am ambushed in my own head. And there it is, a sarcophagus, which means flesh-eating in Latin. Those Romans, the care with which they bed the deceased is admirable. And this is the marble sarcophagus lid with a reclining couple. The description reads, the couple are shown as semi-divine personifications of water and earth. The bare-chested man holds a long reed, and a lizard-like creature crouches beside him. The woman holds a garland and 2 sheaves of wheat, attributes of Tellus, goddess of the earth. At her feet is a furry-tailed mammal with a small Eros on its back, hoping Eros will reunite the lovers in heaven. The man's head is carved so that we can see his expression, stern and dominant, but the woman's head is featureless. Did no one think that carving her likeness was warranted? He looks at her, his arm around her shoulder, and the woman's head is tilted up toward his face. Was that what started it, that he looked when I had forgotten what it was like to be desired? How stupid and careless. Once the limbic system is triggered, all judgment disappears. I spot the boy man at the membership table. I begin to sweat and feel dizzy. A panic attack is coming on. This happens now for no rhyme or reason, tittering just at the edge of consciousness. He wanders into the gallery, and as he passes me, he stops. We say hello, and I watch him circle back to Heracles. To want more is to test the gods. To want less is to decompose. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's great. Patrick Bringley left his job in the editorial events office at The New Yorker. What heresy is this? To become a guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he answered questions such as, "Is this real?" Safeguarded and spent a decade looking at 50 centuries of human art. His beautiful memoir, All the Beauty in the World, describes the solace and inspiration he found there. All the Beauty in the World has been praised in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, NPR, the London Sunday Times, and elsewhere. Please give Patrick Bringley a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for all of you for coming out and Jill doing this event with me. This is very cool. Yeah, my book. So I worked for 10 years as a guard at the Met. As she mentioned, when I was just out of college, I got a job at the New Yorker, just in the events department, but nevertheless, you know, when I was 22 years old, you think you're at a skyscraper at the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway, and I kind of thought that, you know, this is an impressive thing, and I think that that's a very dangerous thing to actually think when you're 22 years old, because, of course, you know, I couldn't write anything yet. I hadn't thought any original thoughts in my life. I hadn't kind of lived any life yet. And it was a good job in some ways, but in other ways, it's just, you know, sort of an office job where you're staring at email and things. And while I was there, my brother got sick, and this is what I'm going to read sort of one of the heavier passages of the book. And all of a sudden, I was spending less time in Midtown Manhattan and more time at my brother's apartment in Queens and hospital rooms. And, you know, well, here, you'll see this in the book. But a lot of the book is, you know, behind the scenes of the Met and all of the 500 guards who work there and the kind of whole deal about the place. But this is a flashback in the book that kind of explains how I got there. So, it was, on the whole, cheerful in Tom's little hospital room. It was simple. It was crosswords, the newspaper, ball games on television, books read out loud, ordering lunch. Tom wasn't restless in his illness. He didn't seek new religion. He liked and loved the things he always had. For me, this threw a kind of halo around the lot so that the ball games were good ball games and the books were good books and the friends who visited were good pilgrims, and all of it simple, all of it an embrace. Tom liked Raphael, so we thumbtacked the Madonna of the Goldfinches above his hospital bed. My dad admires Dickens, so he opened a paperback and read a sad and funny passage. It was curious, the way great art collapsed so simply into so ordinary a setting. I had long supposed otherwise. I thought of great art as a thing to gape up at or stare back at, where nobler persons than ourselves had splashed it around cathedrals or fit it between the covers of great books. And yet, even a story as exalted as The Passion now felt near and unmysterious, being plainly an attempt to express the very plain thing that was happening in that room. The night would fall, and when Tom was very sick, someone would stay with him, usually Krista, his wife. We'd watch television on mute while he slept, and the stillness in the room couldn't be believed, as nothing about any of it could be believed. There's Tom, there's funny old Tom, there's his body that once was big, bounding like old Tom, and is now gentle, graceful like this Tom. How beautiful. Later, I'll roll him on his side, dig my fists into his muscles, rub circles on his aching back, and he'll moan and say thank you quietly, and the stillness will return, and I'll watch him breathe. It was a moment like this one, actually the early dawn, when I sat with my mother at the bedside and watched her take everything in as though for the first time. She looked at her sleeping son, looked at me, saw the light and the body and the horror and the grace. Look at us, she told me. Look, we're a fucking old master painting. A few months later, we visited my mother's 4 siblings in Philadelphia. You can imagine the comfort and also the difficulty of talking with siblings and their grown children after burying your 26-year-old son. It was my mom's idea to find some simpler, quieter place, and the 2 of us stole away. Out of our car windows, we watched the ordinary locomotion of city life, The joggers, dog walkers, all the evidence that the world won't stop turning just because something arresting has happened. Then we turned off the Ben Franklin Parkway and stopped our car at the Museum of Art. In my memory, it was so still in the museums that the statues appeared to have fallen under a recent and sudden enchantment. It was so silent we could hear our footfalls on the pale stone floors. We climbed a stairway toward a golden Diana statue, her weight forever on the ball of one foot, her hand perpetually adding tension to a bowstring. My mom was leading this pilgrimage, and she brought us past fading tapestries and illuminated manuscripts into the old master paintings collection. These galleries resembled a church or a monastery with stained glass windows, a stone baptismal font, holy scenes of suffering and grace of a type familiar to a Philly girl called Maureen Gallagher. And indeed, the atmosphere in the galleries was intensely familiar, though for reasons that had nothing to do with plaid skirts or severe nuns. It was the atmosphere all those months at Tom's bedside, one of speechless mystery, beauty, and pain. Wordlessly, we parted ways, each to find our own sad, bright picture to be near. Mine was a jewel-like panel painted 7 centuries ago by an unknown Italian with a plain, earnest style. It was composed of tempera paint, that is, with an egg yolk base, on a smallish piece of poplar, and it depicted the Virgin Mary with her newborn at the mouth of a grotto or cave. A star of wonder hung over their heads, kings and angels crowded in to bear witness and adore. Mary, appearing immune to the clamor, fixed her eyes on her soundless infant lying peaceably in a manger. A scene of this type is called an adoration, and I held the rather beautiful word in my mind. How useful a name for the kind of tender worship that arises in such a moment. We are silenced by such a vision, softened, made penetrable by what is vibrant and unhidden, but felt only weakly amid the clamor of everyday life. We need no explanation for an adored object. Adding context could only obscure its plain and somehow unmysterious mystery. No doubt you have felt this way about a sleeping child or lover, or maybe about the rising sun or the pounding surf, or maybe about a holy relic or a sweetly painted picture by a long-dead Italian. Watching my big brother squeeze hands and bravely endure, I had felt hardly anything else. There's a special clarity of light that seems to fall from a star of wonder, and it's what the old masters always seem to be painting. I left the picture and went looking for Maureen, my mom, in the early Renaissance galleries. When I spotted her, she was framed by a work more brutal and beautiful and even more truthful than the one I had found. It was painted by a master named Niccolo da Pietro Giurini, a Florentine working in the 14th century. Against a featureless gold background, it depicted a young man who was very beautiful but bluntly dead, supported bodily by his mother, who hugged her son as she would if he were living, a scene that is called a lamentation, or pietà. My mom has always been a good one to cry, at weddings, at the movies, but this was different. She cupped her face and her shoulders shook, and when I met her eyes, I saw that she wept because her heart was full, as well as breaking, because the picture inspired love in her, bringing both solace and pain. When we adore, we apprehend beauty. When we lament, we see the wisdom of the ancient adage, life is suffering. A great painting can look like a slab of sheer bedrock, a piece of reality too stark and direct and poignant for words. An hour or two later, and it was time to leave the museum, back to the so-called real world towering over the bedrock. My parents and sister Mia flew home to Chicago. I took an Amtrak train to my adopted home of New York. I was 25 years old. I joined the rapid, heedless foot traffic of Midtown, uncertain in the broadest sense of where I would go, not to the nearby skyscraper with the high-flying desk job I'd been lucky to get but could no longer stomach. Not along any path, I thought, that would find me scrapping and scraping and muscling my way forward through the world. I had lost someone. I did not wish to move on from that. In a sense, I didn't wish to move at all. In the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I had been allowed to dwell in silence, circling, pacing, returning, communing, lifting my eyes up to beautiful things and feeling sadness and sweetness only. I rocked with a car full of weary passengers on a Brooklyn-bound subway home. An idea was beginning to take shape in my mind. For years, I had noticed the men and women who worked inside New York's great art museum, not the curators, hidden away in their offices, but the guards standing watchfully in the corners. Might I join them? Could it be as simple as that? Could there really be this loophole by which I could drop out of the forward-marching world and spend all day tarrying in an entirely beautiful one? I walked along Brooklyn's Fifth Avenue, passing a half-dozen taquerias on the way to my third-floor walk-up. By the time I turned my key in the door, it all felt remarkably simple. In the fall of 2008, I took up my post at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thanks.
Thank you both. Well, I have to ask this question and see what you guys think too. But in Jill's book, you mention that 100,000 people have fainted in the Met. That's over the whole course. I don't think it's 1 year. But does anyone have any comments or questions? No, you're just stunned.
Questions to ask each other too.
Okay, yeah, we're not going to put it all on you. All right. Would you like to talk here?
Yes, Patrick, I as you were reading, I was thinking about how your book was in some ways a way, or perhaps your job as a museum guard was a way for you to deal with the grief of your brother, and how art perhaps offered solace. Do you want to speak about that? Also in my book, their grief and loss are also part of my story, so then I can talk about that.
Yeah, it's funny, I get asked about that. It's not like it's a sort of straightforward process. Like I went there and I got some lessons of uplift or something that made me just be able to turn the other page. It was more that, I don't know, I had been through something that seemed kind of so just stripped down to the bare essentials of what it means to be human, and you're spending all this time sort of in that space. And then you're expected to just get up out of that and then just rejoin the world where everything is just nonsense, or it feels that way, if you're just answering emails or whatever. And I just felt sort of shell-shocked, and I was just relished the idea of spending all this time where I can just have my head up and I'm not accomplishing anything. I'm not pushing any ball forward. I'm just paying attention to the world around me. And of course, I get to be in this sort of numinous space that kind of feels cathedral-like in its sort of silence and its stillness. And I think having just a good long time to kind of be in that space felt very sort of consoling, to be around these sort of luminous but sad pictures in the old master wing, and then go to some other wing and you're like, oh my God, these things are thousands of years old, and there's something about that just silences your whole soul. But then also the process, I think, of I was there 10 years. So when I started, I was 25 years old. When I ended, I had a couple of kids and I was 35 years old. Like that whole sweep of life is, I think, really when you're learning to become kind of a full-on grown-up. And a lot of that happened at the Met, not just through sort of silence and stillness and contemplation, but also being brought out of my shell by talking to people. It's a living place too. 7 million people come in. They are asking me, is this stuff real? And they're asking for the Mona Lisa and the dinosaurs, And I love that. It just sort of get this sort of patter of life. I kind of learned my rhythm. I could have learned sort of the way that I talk to people, the way that I'm a New Yorker that can talk to the tourists, and then the guards, the fellow guards. There are 500 people just in these corners that that was the whole process, kind of. I don't know if that's clear enough, but how about you, Jill?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I think are central to both of our books is the way in which art sort of inspires and unlocks, particularly in my book, the imagination. And so these pieces that I came across in the museum also are a way for my protagonist to unlock some of the terrors and losses of her past. And so she is, as I mentioned, when the book opens, her only son has left for college, and it's the empty nest. But as she's strolling through the museum one day, and my my novel covers many, many days in the museum. It moves in and out of the museum. But on one visit to the museum, she comes across this marble grave of a little girl carrying a dove. I don't know, you can't see it very well here. But suddenly this triggers my narrator to think about that her son was a twin, and her daughter was lost at birth. So in the novel, she's also has to wrestle a little bit with the ghost of her lost daughter. And so the museum is a guide in a way for part of that journey. And later on in the book, actually what I read earlier, I said something like that my narrator says that the temple of Dundur is where she goes to worship. And that is where she went when she lost her daughter. So she has the opportunity, as art can do for us, is to recollect and mourn and feel close to the spirit of her daughter. And so that was certainly one part of the book that surprised me as I was writing it. And it's interesting, Patrick, about how you write about certain pieces of art that have moved you in some way. Maybe you want to talk about one of them?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about those. I could talk about all the art. No, I'm just kidding. I was there a long time. Those grave markers in the Greek and Roman wing are incredible. Yes. But one thing that I always notice, there's a bunch of them that the symbol on it, it's just a young man usually, but there's women too, who have died, and what they're doing is just sort of shaking hands with one of their father or their brother, and it's a gesture of leave-taking that you also see on Greek vases. You see it on soldiers that are going off to war too. It's this gesture of leave-taking, and I just found it so poignant. It's like just this placid, just kind of acceptance that they're slipping off into this underworld that to the Greeks, I mean, it kind of comports with my view of death. I mean, for the Greeks, they thought of what happened after life as being shapeless and formless and unknown. It's sort of essentially sort of everything in the Greek world has form and shape and vivid and vivacity and life, and even their ideas could be seen. They took the form of gods, and they were very sort of hands-on tactile people like that, and death was everything that isn't. You know? So I always feel that looking at the Koros statue or something, which is this marvelous sort of archaic Greek statue of this young man, and he's, full of life, and he's nude, and he's there's something kind of almost godlike about him. But then you think this was a grave marker too. And this was a young man who died that's being depicted. And that's sort of the duality that they're always trying to get at. Like on the one hand, he's sort of arrogant with his own sense of beauty, his sort of godlike sense of beauty. But also look at that naked skin. That is permeable. That is not armor at all. That can be pierced by anything shot at him. And indeed, he died and slipped off into this world. I don't know. I find it amazing. But yeah, I mean, that's one thing I liked quite a bit about your book is that, at the Met, I feel like all the time I'd see visitors who would walk in and they'd be intimidated by the whole thing because they're reading the placards that are written by some curator, and they're oftentimes, very academic, and they get this sense that oh, this is something that I don't really know about, there's someone upstairs who knows the right answers to these things, but I don't, who am I? And I always wanted to be like, there's no one upstairs that knows the right answers to this stuff, because this stuff is about life and death and suffering and the gods and the cosmos, and nobody knows about any of that. Even the artist who carved that, he didn't think that he was, carving in the archaic era. He thought he was some guy who was, So I always wanted to try to get people, assert your own humanity here. You're the living thing. That thing's made out of stone, So you can think your own thoughts about this thing. You can use this thing to, as Jill said, sort of liven your imagination, or maybe test your own views about life and death, or whatever the case. And I mean, that's what your book was. It was about someone who was going through using the myths to sort of shape their own thinking about their life, about society, about, So what's, I don't know, talk about that.
Okay. Well, what's amazing? I mean, Patrick and I didn't know each other until we were designated to be doing this panel together. And so when I read his book, I was really astonished by some similarities. For instance, Patrick, you write about the Koros statue. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
So.
Yeah, okay. So lo and behold, I have a Koros in my book, and what happens to my narrator when she comes across this Koros, which is sort of the epitome of manhood, the epitome of boyhood transitioning to manhood. And as I mentioned earlier, my protagonist is also suffering over the loss of her son, not the loss, but the grief of this only child who she adored and loves, and who's off to college. And he's a little bit of a partier, let's just put it that way. And he wants to have fun, and she's worried about him, as most mothers would be when they send off their boys to college. And so when she comes across the Koros and other artifacts and statues in the museum, she's also, in a way, trying to understand what it means for a boy to become a man, as going away to college for a boy is really that first initiation into manhood. So the Koros is something that she thinks about. And then later, Patrick, you were talking about the Greek vases and the stories that they tell. And so I have some images too of, there's this one vase that tells the story of the athletes in ancient Greece. Athletics, of course, was a very big part of a boys' society, and also helping to train them perhaps to go to war. And so when my narrator comes across that, her son is also an athlete. So she's also remarking upon, what that means to be an athlete, and considering where his journey might take him.
That prize in four, I've got something to say about
Oh,
that.
good. All right.
Interestingly, that amphora she showed that has these runners. So they're running in the nude, of course. The Greeks like to be nude as much as they possible, and that was for the Pan-Athenaic Games. So the Olympic Games had been going on since 1776 BC, but they would have spin-off games, and that was for the area around Athens. And you would win this if you won the foot race, but you weren't interested in the vase. You were interested in what was in it. You know what was in it? Any guesses? Olive oil. And the winning runner, it was about 10 gallons of olive oil. The winning runner didn't win one of those. He won 60. The winning charioteer won double that, well over 1,000 gallons of olive oil. And it was a life-changing windfall because it was like the oil of its day. You used it for cooking and cleaning, all sorts of religious purposes, for fuel. And they would have just turned that around as quickly as they could, sell it to a wholesaler. And so I always think, when you walk through the Met, if an ancient person walked through the Met, they'd be confused about many things. One thing they'd be confused about, they'd say, well, when are you going to paint all these white statues? Like, they would have had their nipples copper, they would have teeth silver, they would have had precious gems in the eyes to get this sort of sense of verisimilitude. Our whole sort of vision of sort of classical, Greek whiteness is just an accident of the fact that the paint flaked away. And even when they dug this stuff up, in the Renaissance, Michelangelo looks at it, the paint was already gone. So then they make things white. But then they would also be like, why are you showing like sort of the Amazon box that our olive oil came in, But it is amazing that they would make that stuff beautiful. Like all of these, as a guard, you get to think about these kind of big questions. And so one big question you come up is like, well, what is art? This is just a mass-produced olive oil bottle. But it's so beautiful. And to me, just one definition I came up with, which I'm sure is not a total definition, is just something that is better than it has any right to be, is art. That's more beautiful, that's more delicate, that's more involved. Because there's something in our species, clearly, that whether it's, playing piano or cooking meals or whatever, that has just gotten so far beyond what anyone could have a right to expect, and because we iterate, and even culturally, we just progress, and you get this absurd distance between, the practicality and what we as a species are driven to create. And for me, that sort of creates sort of this fluttering in the chest that is just what's so marvelous about art. What about you? You think art's any good?
Oh, you're asking the right person. No, art has inspired so much of my own creativity and my own work, and certainly this novel. I actually, before I wrote The Deceptions, I have a novel called The Prize, which is about an artist and a galleryist in the contemporary art world. But just going back to the artifacts and what they can inspire, in my novel, one of something that I came across in the museum was very inspiring. I mentioned that my protagonist is a poet, and that her book of poems that she's nervous about getting out in the world is called The Rape of the Swan. And so this is, The Rape of the Swan is a book-length poem that she's written that's inspired by Yeats's poem, Leda and the Swan. And so, of course, in the museum, there are, I don't know, Patrick, you might know, at least, so many images, whether through paintings, through artifacts, through statues of Leda and the Swan. And so one day I came across this terracotta relief from a lamp with Leda and the Swan, and Zeus has turned. So you know the story that Zeus shapeshifts to rape women, and so he's desirous of Leda, and he turns himself into a swan to rape her. And so this is the little image here. It's a terracotta relief from a lamp with Leda and the Swan. So just the idea here is that, how even the most minute detail can tell a story. And, whether you go into a museum as a writer and poet, as I have experienced art, but just the way everyday people go into the museum and are inspired or quieted somehow. I always, just one quick anecdote. When I first moved to New York City, I didn't know many people at all. I had come from a graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop. So I moved from Iowa City to New York City, which is quite a two sides of a coin. And I had a job as an editorial assistant in publishing, but on the weekends, every Saturday and Sunday, I lived on the west side, so I would take the bus to the Upper East Side and go into the Metropolitan Museum and explore one particular gallery. And it was like a comfort to me. It was like finding friends with art. And when my first book of poetry was published, my editor at Knopf, who I worshipped, he brought in many of the great poets, such as Mark Strand and Wallace Stevens, and his list of poets at Knopf was amazing. And he was just a wonderful man who also lived a life of art and poetry. And he told me that every Sunday, him and his wife would stroll to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was like their religion. And they would go to one gallery, and then they would go out to lunch. So I'm sure you have encountered many passersby at the museum that have, can you tell us some anecdotes about people you've encountered, like myself?
Oh, sure.
Wandered in.
I've probably seen most of you guys, probably at some point. Oh, yeah. I mean, we get regulars. There's this young man, Yuki. He's got a developmental something going on, but he comes religiously, and he always has the printout of the subway advisories. And he, as the guards, he says, like, what train are you taking home? You're like, oh, I'm taking the N. He's like, that's running local. It's running over the bridge, or it's running under the tunnel to Brooklyn. And there are actually a couple of people like that who sort of know all the guards. But it's interesting. I mean, what you said, what's cool about a museum is that it's not like linear. There's not someone just grabbing you by the nose and pulling your way through. You can make your own museum. And you notice about visitors that some of them are there because they love the arts, and they are, going very slowly, reading all the labels. But there are some people who, they just love the atmosphere of the place. They treat it like a public park. There are plenty of people who go and they don't know where they are. They have no idea. They walk in. It's maybe their first visit to the Met, first visit to a big city. They're looking around, and those are the people asking you, like, is there the Constitution here? Like, what's this? And, I never minded that at all because, on the one hand, I'm sure I would be just as ignorant in many of their places of work. And as a guard, sometimes I'd show up to work and, I might as well be working at the Duane Reade or something. My mind's not on kind of big elevated things. And then someone comes up to you with their just eyes wide, all spun around, and they are open to you just explaining like the history of civilization to them, They're like in the ancient Chinese galleries, and they're like, that's like 4,000. I don't even get it. Like, what is the deal here? And I love that. And I always thought that that's sort of the proper way to relate to the Met. Everyone should feel all spun around. The director of that place should, because no one has an understanding of more than a sliver of what's in there. And even of the sliver you have an understanding of, you don't have a true understanding of it. It's just endless. It's endless. And that's precisely what I liked about it. Like when you say that your imagination, like the job of a guard is so cool because you don't have some sort of checklist. You're not like moving forward through life. You're not trying to accomplish something. And I miss that so much because I could just show up to work and my mind could move sideways and backwards and around the bend, and I might be in the Roman galleries, and today I want to learn all about ancient Rome, and I'm going to, figure out the sequence of the emperors or something. And the other days, you might not be interested in Rome at all, and you're just looking at watching people, or you're just paying attention to the beauty of the human form in these statues, or whatever the case may be. And I found as a writer, I'm sure that if I remained at the New Yorker magazine just trying to write little internet copy or whatever you do to start, like I couldn't have written a book because I wasn't any good at that. And also like my mind needed to move. It needed to like move in different directions. And if I just tried to push forward through a little narrow channel, I don't think I ever would have made it. But the museum, in that same way, I feel like all sorts of people, they go there often to kind of take a breath from what's happening out there. And there are all these things that sort of quiet you, that kind of quiet your soul. I think we probably both had that experience.
Definitely. Yes, I was thinking we should open it up to questions from the audience.
I'm just kind of speaking to your book, Patrick. I'm sort of blown away by how much I stereotype guards in museums. Like I think I'm ashamed of myself. But I'm thinking, I think of them as, thinking about that their feet hurt. And you had this.
There's some of that too.
Right. But did you fit in with the guards at the Met? And are they as varied as?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing is there's more than 500. So a sort of tipping point has been reached such that there is no culture of the guards. There's cultures, many, many, many. Nobody is sort of pressured to fit in with one another. It's a bunch of grown-ups doing a job. And they, 40% of New York City is foreign-born. I'd guess 50, 60% of the guards are foreign-born. They've had every sort of life you could possibly imagine. They've been cops, they've been school teachers, they've been military commanders, they've been just everything you could, they've been lawyers, they've been commercial airline pilots, because they've done a lot of things in the old country often. And then a lot of them are artists, and a lot of them are, one guard, I call him Troy in the book, I said, he's a very older, dignified man. And I said, well, why did you become a guard at the Met? And he said, well, the only thing I've ever wanted to be is an independently wealthy patron of the arts, and this comes closest. So there's an element of that as well. And I think there's also twofold. We used to debate with each other. We're like, does this job attract characters or does this job form characters? And I think it's both. Because I think it attracts characters, because it attracts people who don't want to be pushed around like by a boss, because you just sort of left on your own mostly. And then it forms characters because if you've got 8 or 12 hours in a day to just think your thoughts, that's going to make you more of yourself than you ever were. Yeah.
I was just curious, I know that your mom on occasion calls on your interest in art, and I don't know about you, Jill, but I was just wondering, when you guys were younger, did either of you draw or paint, or did you study art history? One thing that I haven't read your book yet, but I want to, and your book is from someone who comes from the museum world and art history and everything. I just thought, this guy can really write about art, and he knows his stuff. And so, did all that knowledge come through the process of working here, or were you guys, I just would like to know your art and art history.
Yeah, I've always
before all, this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I've always loved art. My mom always took us to the Art Institute of Chicago. She loved art. Neither of us, though, I didn't study art formally. I did a little bit in college. I took a couple classes, but mostly I learned on the job, and I can't draw. But mostly I don't know. I've always loved this stuff. As far as learning how to write about it, that was just a years-long process of scribbling in notebooks, because art is hard to write about because it doesn't talk, It's like, I feel like it's stubbornly not words. It's something besides words. So to try to draw words out of it can just be maddening. So I think I just wrote in circles until I sort of figured out a formula, or not a formula. It's never a formula, but I figured out certain things started to speak.
Yeah, Mira, for me, I think I'm glad you asked that question because it made me think back. Like you, I grew up in Cleveland. And as a young child, I remember vividly going on the bus when we were at school. Our art teacher took us to the Cleveland Museum of Art, of course, and it was amazing. And I really have such a vivid memory of sitting on those little stools that they had for the little kids who would come into the art museum. And I just was, just so inspired and connected by seeing all this amazing art in the museum. My mother also was a lover of beauty, and so we had that in common growing up. And then, even when I was in high school in Cleveland, I used to go to the art museum and just, I loved the Rodin statue of the thinker. And, I remember even at that young age, just feeling like art spoke to me in ways that I couldn't articulate within myself. Same with then poetry, art, we always say with poetry that poetry is about saying the unsayable, how a poem can say the unsayable. And for me, art and paintings are like that as well, that you see something and it's a personal experience. One of the things I admired, I told Patrick about his book, is that you encounter the museum from a layman's perspective, because, as Patrick said, he didn't really study art in any depth. And so it's great to take a journey with somebody who is just kind of experiencing this vast collection in a very individual way, which for me is what art should do. It should ignite our own memories, our own thoughts and experiences and emotions. I think.
Yes. Here it is, the Met, the most powerful, the richest, the most well-endowed museum, perhaps in the world, in the most populous, rich, powerful city in the world, and here you are, writing these books. And I think of a friend who lived near the Met who pretended, or we would pretend with him, that the Met was just merely an extension of his apartment. And the question that occurs to me as I think about your discussion, your books, is: does the Met belong to you, or do you belong to the Met? Which of those two resonate the most with you?
Well, very quickly, I would say that the Met belongs to me. And my character even says that it's her home. It's her second home.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like you'll see guards that are leaning on against walls with just the most proprietary look, And I think 100% the guards feel like, in a way, the museum is ours much more than anyone upstairs, more than the trustees, because we're out with the art, We're in the ball game, they're backstage. But yeah, I mean, it raises a point too. One thing that I think about sometimes, if you're in a great big museum, I think something that's worth doing is feeling yourself invisibly small. Like, that is a pleasure in life. It's like when you look up at the nighttime stars and you're like, oh my God, I am just so insignificant, and you just sort of disappear. And you can do the same as the Met. You wander from Greece to Rome to Egypt to Cambodia, and you're just like, oh my Lord, my little thoughts inside my head, they are of no interest to any of these people. But then you can also say what I was saying earlier, where you say, this stuff is made out of stone, and I'm a living human being. And you can flip it and say, well, really everything is in the Met is just expressing the potentialities, the capacities of my heart and my head and my hands. This is a museum about sort of singing the praises of human beings. And I'm a human being. And you can kind of flip it, and you can feel sort of a sense of, because I think you should do both things in the museum. You should feel really quiet and very humbled, but then you can also flip a switch and say, well, I'm going to use this stuff for my own purposes. I'm going to pick favorites. I'm going to have ideas about this that'll sharpen my ideas about. I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to, that sort of use it as fuel.
I was wondering how often, as a guard, you had to do parties at night. How did you wrangle them? I mean, I'm very familiar. They're different from the the daytime crowd.
Yeah, I only worked the gala. So the guards all call the gala the party of the year, because I guess that's what they used to call it in the old days. And when I worked at the New Yorker, I worked enough fancy parties, so I didn't really need that. But you can work OT and do those parties. I worked it once, and they put me in the actual costume institute as opposed to where everyone's clinking glasses. And I thought, oh, this is going to be nice. I'm standing next to the dresses, and Tom and Giselle are going to come through. But no, nobody came through. Nobody. They all stayed at the party. I didn't see anybody. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's too interesting. I don't know.
So I was just at the Met at the Monet show, and a woman there kept trying to touch the painting. Lard was kind of chasing her around. And he'd say, don't step back. She said, well, I keep forgetting. And I wondered, now, what is that guy trained to do? And here you are. You can tell me, how are you actually trained? Like, are you trained in tackling people? And are you trained in art, history? Like, I asked a guard something, and also, how do you know how to get out of there? I asked 3 times. How do you get to the exit? So you seem to have to know everything.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you learn that on the job, I mean, we're not formally trained in the art, no. Just a lot of people take an interest in it. I mean, not all, but a lot of people. No. But yeah, as far as touching, yeah, people touch things all the time. I mean, painting's not so much. But, I had a young man try to climb up on a Venus statue, and he was trying to sit in her lap, and I stopped him, and he was very polite because he just did not know. People do not know. So he's like, oh, and he looked at her, and she had a missing head and missing arms, and he looked all around the Roman court, and he said, so all this broken stuff broke in here?
But when you look at a piece of art, the paintings and sculpture, are they different? It's made by male artists. I don't know the percentage of the women artists in the museum. So are there similarities or differences when you look at art and also read a book, male artists or authors? Thank you.
So are you asking sort of how the museum or art represents the patriarchy, or the difference between the male and female?
You look at a piece of art, a painting done by a male artist or women artist.
Oh.
So difference in how you react to it.
Right. I'll answer that by sort of going back to my novel, because in The Deceptions, my protagonist is a poet, as I said, who wrote a book called The Rape of the Swan. And there's a visiting poet at her school who is very competitive with her. And they both approach art in a very different way. And I have a scene where they're talking about how they create. And the visiting poet is very brash, and he sort of says, I know from your poetry that you write out of loneliness, you write out of despair. I write out of power. I write because I want to be heard. And so I think that's how I'm going to answer that question. But I have to say, just to promote a book at Norton, one of my colleagues edited a book called Art Without Men, and that's doing really well.
Patrick, I love the book that I'm trying to do. I'm curious if you were working on something else. If this is
I am. I'm in the early phases. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of talking and at museums, which is super cool. And I do tours of the Met. If anyone wants to go to my website. So I'm trying to do those things to just make enough scratch to have enough time to kind of think some thoughts before I write a new book, you know? I think it's a little like, you know, you're a rock band and your first album is everything you've been thinking and feeling since you were a teenager. And then it's like, all right, now make another one in 12 months. I don't know how to do that. But I do have a flicker of an idea, and I think it'll be art related. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
I was curious whether you witnessed any protests like the ones that Nan Golden led at the Met, and what other ways, I mean, you mentioned everybody makes their own museum, and it seems to be, I mean, I only saw like video or film footage of the protests, but they were like works of art themselves, like installations. So.
Yeah, I remember that day. I think it was in 2012. I'm sorry? Okay, I'll retell. So in 2012, I'll tell it this way. Somebody said something crazy is going on in the temple, one of my fellow guards. And what happened is Nan Golden, who's an artist and a photographer, she came in with, 50 or 60 of her minions, but of course they were not advertising themselves as such. And they, in the Temple of Dender, which used to be called the Sackler Wing, they had a bunch of pill bottles, and they threw the pill bottles into the water there. And it was actually a very effective protest, because 2012 was kind of early in that whole thing. So I remember learning from that. I was like, what, the Sacklers? I didn't know what that was. To me, that's much more legible than like, the soup on the Van Gogh. That's not very legible to me, like what exactly that protest is. But yeah, I forgot, what was the second half of your question? Yeah. The weirdest thing, I think, is that my book is called All the Beauty in the World, and the documentary about Nan Golden and that is called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. That's just total coincidence.
How much of the beauty of the museum and the solace that you found in it is due to the atmosphere, the hushed voices and the dim light and large echoing figures?
It's very interesting that what's cool about the Met is it's not one building, it's all these buildings that have been smashed together, and all those places have their own atmospheres. Actually, one of the only ways that is remembered is, the guards call Section A is the A building, the old 1880 Met, which is now the medieval wing right in the middle. But that will have a different atmosphere. Like you mentioned, the dim lights, like the quietest galleries in the Met are the Asian art, and it's because the lights are low and everyone whispers. Like the lighting has profound effects to how people act. And you'll notice that as a guard all the time. So if you're in some bright skylit gallery, it's like a bowling alley compared to that. And I always liked being moved to sort of different areas to have sort of those different experiences. But I do think that's a cool thing about the Met. It's not one vibe in that place. And of course, it's from the art as well. The art kind of is, I don't know, giving off its vibe.
Yeah, I was wondering if you, first of all, it's a very beautiful passage you read. Did you feel respected as a guard? At times did you feel disrespected? One question. Second question, I couldn't help thinking, listening to you, of a nonfiction book that got a lot of attention years ago, of a journalist who became guard, I think it was Rikers, back to the tombs. It was an intentional deception. He was writing the book in the beginning, it sounds as if we were
No.
Did the other guards know you were writing eventually?
A few of my friends did eventually, but not really. Yeah. But yeah, to your first question, whether I felt respected or disrespected, well, both. I mean, there was certainly the Met is so big that I kind of understand why the curators don't get to know us, because there's a lot of us. So there's kind of like, how exactly would that work? But on the other hand, you go into the cafeteria, the people in the cheap suits are sitting together and the people in the expensive suits are sitting together, and there's never the twain shall meet, And that's not so good. And it's also not so good that the big bosses are never calling us in to be like, what should we fix in the galleries? Because we could tell them tons of things to fix. Like just label. The one example I give all the time is Washington Cross in the Delaware, probably the most famous painting in the joint. On the label, it says that the frame is a reproduction. Now, you cannot put the word reproduction near a famous painting because all day long people look at that and go, oh, it's a reproduction. Like all day long, you know? So that's something a guard could tell them, fix that little thing. I mean, as far as the visitors too, you get people who just want to award it. You know, you're telling people the gallery's closed, but this person's worth a few $1 million, so he doesn't want to move out of the gallery. You get that a lot too. So you get good days and bad days.
Did you ever feel competitive if you were like in a social situation and somebody's going on about the frig? Oh, I love the frig, or something like Grotto, and you say, but the Met, you know, like, did you ever feel like?
I knew a guard who used the Whitney as his punchline all the time. It's so funny. Like people would be like, is there an elevator? He'd go, of course there's an elevator. What do you think this is, the Whitney? It was just very funny. I think are we wrapping up, I think. Here, let me hand off the mic.
So we do have to thank you. I don't want to cut short our appreciation. Thank you both so much. This was so much fun. We are selling books, and these folks are signing books, so you can get a little leg up on your holiday shopping there. All right. Thank you so much.